Well, hey everybody, my clock shows that it's the top of the hour, so why don't we go ahead and get started? My name is Kathryn, and I'm teaching this class today on understanding intended identity. This is a concept that changed the way I do family history in Family Search's Family Tree, and it solved so many problems for me. And so I'm excited to share it with you and to um, hear your questions and get your feedback. So obviously, I'm teaching remotely. I'm currently located in Provo, Utah. But as we go along, any questions that you have, I don't know how good the audio will be for me hearing your questions. So you might need to go to the front of the room or something. I don't know. But if you do have questions at natural breaks in like we've got some section headings, I'll just pause and ask for questions and we'll address any questions that come up. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Cool. Sounds good. And I heard that, yes, loud and clear. So that's awesome. So, intended identity is the key to fixing and avoiding problems in Family Search's family tree. So, let's look at our little agenda for today. First of all, we're going to talk about what is intended identity because I think that's probably an unfamiliar concept to most of us. Why is it important? How do you determine it? And then we're going to walk through some examples. So I did want to be clear about the scope of this class today. This class, even though it says that intended identity is the key to fixing problems, we're not actually going to walk through fixing any problems in this class. Instead, we're going to focus on understanding intended identity. The class will show how knowing a person's intended identity makes it easier to fix those tricky problems. And if you want to learn more about fixing sticky problems, there's actually a recorded webinar on YouTube. And so here's a link to it. I can give Cameron a link. Excuse me. I'm just recovering from COVID, so I'm still coughing a bit. Sorry, which is another reason you're probably glad I'm not there in person. So there is a recording on YouTube for this. This link is live, and so I can either put it in the chat or give Cameron a link to this slide deck that he can give to anybody who's interested. But then also the next hour, I'm teaching a class on this topic. So if you're interested in sticking around, that the next class will actually tell you how to use this information and walk through untangling a mess in Family Tree. So, what is intended identity? Very simply, when somebody creates a profile in Family Tree, they intend that profile to represent a certain human being. That's the intended identity. So, for example, here is a profile of Joseph Aminadab Quabell. As we look at this in the change log, and we'll get into that, we see that the profile was created for a man, a human named Joseph A. Quabell, who was born on this date in this location, married this woman, and so forth. What's interesting about that is identity is typically established through four things: names, dates, places, and relationships. And that's how we tell how a digital record or a paper record or whatever it may be of a human, that's how we tell which human it's talking about. Well, at this point, you might be going, duh, that sounds like a no-brainer. Because if I created the profile in Family Tree, obviously I know which human they represent. Plus, can't I tell just by looking at it? So what is the big deal? Well, that works really well in a personal tree. So if you keep your tree on Ancestry or Roots Magic or Ancestral Quest or something like that, where it's not a shared tree, but it's just your personal private tree, that you know who the people are that you created. But in a shared tree, such as Family Tree, it's actually not that simple for a couple of reasons. One is obviously we don't create every profile in the tree. There's over 1.5 billion names there now. And so obviously many people have contributed those names. So if we didn't create the profile, we don't automatically know who they were intended to be. Not only that, and probably more seriously, is that intended identity can be changed through edits, incorrect merges, and other errors. In other words, the apparent identity on the page may not be the original intended identity. So why is intended identity important? Well, family tree is a shared tree, right? We're all cooperating to build a pedigree of the human family. Whenever people participate together in some kind of common activity, a shared understanding is essential to avoid confusion. One analogy is driving. So if we did not, just think how it would be if we didn't have roads to drive on or lanes to stay in or traffic signals or whatever. Even with those things, we sometimes have accidents. If we didn't have those things, driving would be a hopeless mess. It just would be very, very difficult to get from point A to point B. Another example is words. So when we speak to each other in order to communicate, we need to know what the words mean, right? Have any of you gone to a foreign country where you didn't speak the language? And you heard other people, you heard sounds coming out of people's mouths, but what did it mean? There was no way to know the meaning if you didn't know the language. So those are two examples of how if we're going to work on a shared activity, we've got to have some kind of shared understanding. And it's the same in family tree. In order to collaborate meaningfully, we've got to be able to agree on which human being each profile represents. What happens if we've got different opinions? I've got a real live example from my tree. Now, these, of course, these aren't real users, they're just photos. But to illustrate the idea, let's say that this user thinks that the profile ending in CKX is for a guy named Francis Bescaby, who was christened in 1734 in the parish of Cranwell. But this guy comes along and he goes, "Oh, I think that profile is for this guy that was same name, but he was born in 1737, 3 years later in a different parish, in the parish of Harmston." Well, this actually happened on my line, and we got this. So we've got a guy being born af actually after he was christened, which is not possible, right? So because you've got to be alive to be christened in the Church of England. So he's christened here in 34, but not born till 37. We've got a problem here. Who is the profile really for? Is it for the guy that was born in 37, or is it for the other guy that was born in 34? We actually can't tell just by looking at this page. So as this example shows, if we don't consider the intended identity, we can end up with conflicting information and uncertain identities. And we can actually even end up with hidden identities if you've got a bad merge that totally hides one of the people that was merged into them. So without knowing the intended identity of a family tree profile, we're really building on shifting sand because we can't really tell which vital information is right. We can't tell which family members really belong. We can't tell which sources apply. And if there are merges, we can't tell which are correct and which are incorrect. So here is a simple principle, and I need to be really clear that this is not a family search rule. You won't find it anyplace in a policy. It just, to me, makes the most sense. So the principle that I have found is the most useful to go on is that the identity at the time the profile was created should take precedence. And if the identity was changed later on, we want to restore the profile to that original identity. Otherwise, we're driving without traffic rules. So, any questions at this point?
No.
Okay, let's go ahead then. How do we determine intended identity in family tree? Remember, in your own personal tree, you are very likely to just know it. But in a shared tree, How do we determine who that person was meant to represent? The easiest way, the actually the only reliable way I've found is to go into the change log. So you look at the earliest entries for the name, the vital events, and the relationships. If you're not familiar with the change log, the way you, and a lot of people aren't, the way you get into it is on the person page, look under latest changes and click show all. And that gets you into the change log. So here are a couple of examples. I was working with a friend of mine, Jenna, on this person. Her name is Lottie Crossland, and we researched her carefully. So we knew her birth date, her birthplace, and her parents. So this profile, when my friend Jenna created this profile, she fully intended it to be for Lottie Crossland, who was born in 84 in Rotherham, Yorkshire, had this dad, George Henry, and this mom, Kathryn Fox. This uniquely identifies this profile and says this is the human being that this profile is meant to represent. If somebody came along later, and I've seen this happen, but not on this one, but on different profiles. But for example, suppose they changed it to Charlotte Crossingham or something like that, born in 1887 in Lincolnshire, with a dad of John and a mother of Sarah, and that can be done through a bad merge. Well, that just turned her into a different person than the intended identity. But fortunately, the changelog will retain these entries, so you can go back and you could see what the original intended identity was. Let's look at another related example of Lottie's mom, Kathryn. So when Kathryn was created, she has a birth date of 1846, about 1846 in Stockport, Cheshire. Got her name as Kathryn Fox, Dad Edward, Mom Rosie. One thing I did want to point out about this particular record that that may be helpful to you in the future is notice the contributor. It says family search. And a lot of times when people see that, they think, oh, family search contributed this information. Therefore, it must have been validated and it must be perfectly trustworthy. Well, actually, I was in a meeting with a family search manager and we asked him about this. And he said, oh, this means that notice the date of 2012. That's when Family Tree started and the old system, which was ironically called new.familysearch.org, that's when that shut down. So in 2012, they transferred all the information from the old system, new.familysearch.org, to the new one, which we're using today, called Family Tree. But because of privacy issues, they didn't feel comfortable transferring all the old usernames, the people who had created those profiles in new.familysearch.org. So they just stamped all those imports with Family Search. So when you see 2012 and Family Search, it doesn't mean that that information was validated necessarily. It just means that it came from the old system. And that can be useful when you're trying to understand intended identity. Let's look at a third quick example. We're going back to our buddy, Francis Bescaby. So notice when we go to his change log, he was originally intended to be Francis with a slightly different spelling, but not really a huge deal because at this time in England, many people were not literate, so they did not know how to spell their own name. They didn't have the chance for education. So the clergyman or the registrar or whoever would just spell it the way it sounded. And so this guy was, it's still essentially the same name, but look at the key vital. 1734 Harmston. So he was originally intended to be the guy that was christened in 1734, not the guy that was born in 37. So he's got this dad and he's got this mom. Let's look then, how did that other birth information get added if it wasn't part of his original intended identity? Well, as we scroll up in the change log, oh, I should back up a second. Notice that this person was created in May of 2018. And then as we scroll up the changelog to the later entries, we find an entry in July, and it is actually for a merge. A merge was done on this person, and that's how the birth came over. So somebody merged the guy born in 37, same name, Francis Pesceby, but merged the guy born in 37 with the guy christened in 34, which is, of course, it's not possible for them to be the same people. So this tells us that we've got a bad merge that we've got to undo, but that's beyond the scope of this class. Let's look. This is actually going a little faster than I expected. You guys might get some free time back today. So let's look at example number 4. This is a little bit more convoluted, but I think to that degree, it's also more useful. So we're going to talk now about how to use intended identity to tell if a merge is correct or incorrect. So here we've got two guys named Samuel Hibbert. This again is an entry from Samuel's changelog showing a merge. And this guy, R8H, is the surviving person. He's the person we see in Family Tree. This guy ending in 9, I keep wanting to say VW, like the car instead, but it's WV. That just feels awkward to say. This guy ending in 9WV got merged into this guy. Was it a correct merge? There were a lot of red flags on the person page that led me to believe it. Probably there were some bad merges on this guy. A clue to that is that look at the reason statement that the user who merged it chose. Some details contain minor conflicts. Almost every time, I would say 99% of the time that I see that merge reason statement used, the merge was wrong because the minor conflicts indicated that they were actually two different people. So just as a side note, if you find yourself merging and you want to choose this reason statement that says that there's details with conflicts, I would recommend backing out and doing more research and not doing the merge until you're absolutely sure they're the same person. Let's look at what happened with this Samuel Hibbert merge. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into the survivors changelog R8H. When I scroll clear down to the bottom, this is what I find. I find that his parents are Mark Hibbert, excuse me, and Mary Bradbury. His name was originally Samuel Hibbert, so that hasn't changed. That's good because sometimes I have found names that have changed, as when somebody merged two spouses of a person and they were different people, but I have no idea why they merged the two spouses together. So the guy would only have one wife, but he really had two different wives. So his name is Samuel Hibbert, and he was christened in 1830 in Cheshire, in England. He died in 55, and he was born, we've actually got a birth date here for 29. So we've got a pretty good original intended identity with a name, a birth year, birthplace, not so helpful, that's pretty broad, but the christening date and place are a lot more helpful. The parents are very specific and we've got a specific death date. So we've got a good idea of which human being this record represents, this profile represents. Now let's look at the other change log, and it's actually quite a bit less complete. So we look here and we see that our guy, 9WV, is the dad of this guy, Samuel Edward Hibbert. We've got a name, we've got a sex, but we've got no death date. We've got no other vitals, such as a birth, birthplace, anything else. We don't even have a spouse. All we know about this guy is that when he was imported from new.familysearch.org in 2012, it was meant to represent a guy named Samuel Hibbert, who is the dad of another Samuel Hibbert, who was born this year in this location. But this is enough of a clue, the son, or it should be, to figure out the identity, the correct identity of the dad. I don't know about you, but I can't hold tons of information in my brain a lot of times, and I find it helpful to get things out on paper or into a digital document. And so in this case, I'm going to compare what we know about these two guys. So this is all stuff we've already looked at. You know, he's born in 29, christened in 30, et cetera, et cetera. This guy, we don't know a whole lot about him except he's the dad of this guy, the Samuel Ebert. See Hibbert, Edward Hibbert. I tried to say Edward and Hibbert at the same time and it came out Ebert. So Samuel Edward Hibbert. So the question we need to answer is this guy, christened in 1830 in Hyde, the same guy as this guy who is the dad of Samuel Edward Hibbert? Right now, looking at that information, we do not have enough information to tell. It's very risky to conclude that two people are the same just because they have the same name. Almost all of the time, they won't be. If you ever want to do a fun experiment, go into Family Tree and just search for a name like Samuel Hibbert or Mark Jones or Francis Bescovy or whatever, and look at all the results that come up that are clearly for different people. I think a lot of times we don't stop to think how often names get reused in families and in countries. So the fact that these guys are both named Samuel Hibbert is absolutely no guarantee that they are the same person. So the purpose of this class is not to dive into the specifics of research methodologies. It's beyond the scope. So I'll just show you what I found when I started to research these guys. First of all, it was pretty easy to find him in the census because we had a good most of the time, I shouldn't say, but much of the time, in England in the 18 and 1700s, if a child was christened someplace, it was very near or it was the place where they were born. So I found this Samuel Hibbert in the census. He was living in Hyde. The parents matched, and his birthplace was given as Hyde. So now I know this guy was born in Hyde. However, when I started tracing this guy, I found, first of all, his son in the census. And I knew it was him because it had the exact name, it had the dad, it had the right year. And guess where he was born? Totally different place, Gorton, Lancashire. And as I did more research and traced, so this guy, Samuel, appeared with him in the census, not surprisingly. And so, as I used that information to follow this guy backward in the census, I discovered that he was born in 26 in Gorton, and his parents were not Mark and Mary, they were John and Martha. So these guys were totally two different people, and they should not have been merged. So that is an example of how discovering or determining the intended identity, first of all, it could have, if somebody had done that, they could have avoided the bad merge, but the bad merge was done. Now we used intended identity to know that we needed to undo this bad merge. So the question always comes up about sources and intended identity. I've had multiple people say, can't I just use the attached sources to determine the intended identity? You would hope that you could, right? The trouble is, in a shared tree, unfortunately, we can't rely entirely on the attached sources because incorrect sources are often attached through bad merges. The other day I was working on a guy, what was his name? I don't remember, but I do remember his first name was William. I don't remember the last name, but he had two 1841 censuses attached. Turns out they were both wrong, and the right one wasn't attached. So in a shared tree, you can't be confident, totally confident that all the sources do pertain to that person. So again, our only reliable baseline is to go back to the changelog. When this person was created, who were they intended to be? So, wow, it's only 11:24, and this actually brings us to the wrap up. So we've got about 5 more minutes, and then we can take any questions that you have. But I wanted to just do a summary in terms of key takeaways from the class today. When someone creates a person's profile in Family Tree, they intend it to represent a certain human being. Very simply, that's the intended identity. In a personal tree, we take that for granted because after all, we know the identity of the people that we put in our personal tree. But in a shared tree, the original intended identity can be changed or lost through wrong edits, bad merges, incorrect relationships, and so forth. So it's most reliable to use the earliest information in the changelog to determine the intended identity. Knowing intended identity is a key to avoiding and undoing incorrect merges. If you're thinking about merging two records, but you don't yet know the intended identity, it's better not to merge and get that identity figured out before you decide whether or not to merge. Determining, and this is the last thing, determining intended identity is not a requirement or even a policy. It's just one more way to be confident that you're doing accurate work in Family Tree. So that brings us to the end of our class today. Are there any questions? Okay, I will take the silence as a no, and I'm hanging on until the next class. So if you do end up having questions, please do feel free to ask. But for now, you've got, I guess, about a half an hour back in your schedule. So thank you so much for coming, everybody.
Kathryn, you've got a question.
Yeah, I do have.
Yes, yes.
In, I've just got a situation in my family where uh, the names have been changed 7 times
Oh, wow.
with the same person, and I feel like I've got a personal vendetta with him.
Oh, that's so hard. Oh,
And I don't know his relationship, but I was the one that put it into Family Search. And
mhm.
it's all over the spelling of a name.
Oh
And
dear.
if you go back through the change log, you can see that, he changed it, I changed it, he changed it, I changed it. And
hmm
it's they haven't been merged because it's the same individual.
hmm
So I what I want is an easy fix. Can I, I want to be able to lock the spelling of this great grandfather's name. And
Right.
um, so other than problems with the bad merges that you've been talking about with the intended identity,
Yeah.
is there any way to I don't know, justify um, the changes? And do I just say, oh, well, at least his work has been done and I don't have to worry about it?
That is such a good question. Is the name dramatically different or is it pretty similar, like the difference between SON and SEN?
Exactly. It's ISOM, and I have documents that have ISOM. Well, he has 3 documents that say ISAM, and they are the same.
Mm,
And
you can tell. Yeah.
I come from a long family of illiterate farmers.
Uh-huh.
So it is a simple process, and I know
Uh-huh.
work has been done and I should just be okay with it. But for anybody that comes after me, it could trigger more of the same actions.
Right, and confusion really, because I've noticed especially with, and you've probably seen this true too, with new users or novices in family history, they don't understand how fluid the spelling was. And so if they see a different spelling, they might go, oh, that's not the same guy. It can't be because it's SAM instead of SOM or whatever. Let me ask you this. Is one spelling used more often in the records than another, or is it pretty equally divided in the sources?
It's close. It's 4 for ISOM and 3 for ISAM.
Oh, dang. I was hoping that, sometimes it'll be like one for the weird spelling and 20 for the good one. But in this case, oh, so I guess like you said, there's not a simple answer. I I think you got to pick your battles. And so this is just my personal opinion. I would just decide whether you think it's worth fighting. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean fighting the battle or not. And you may decide, okay, this is not worth my time. I'm just going to let it go. On the other hand, you may say, look, this is worth my time because this spelling could confuse people. And have you tried to message the guy?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so that sound from the tone of your voice, it sounds like that was maybe not exceptionally successful. So, if you've tried, and I was going to suggest reporting abuse before I understood the situation. Like if somebody's really maliciously messing up your stuff, and it's more than a spelling variation, then you can report abuse. But on this one, I don't think Family Search would consider the spelling variation an abuse. Um, so I guess the first thing I would do, and this is just my opinion, so maybe pray about it, but I think the first thing is decide if it's worth fighting this battle. And if it's not, one thing you can do, if haven't already, you probably have, is go to the other information section and just enter an alternate spelling of the name. And then that way people will see it. And you could even put an explanatory note with the alternate spelling and just say, hey, in about half the sources, it's this one way, and the half the sources, it's this other way. Just be aware that the name is spelled both ways or something like that. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think so.
I hope so. There's just not an easy answer, darn it. And one other thing is, keep watching it. And if that user kind of drops off and stops participating, then you can change it and hopefully it would stay.
Sneak it in.
It's very different working in a shared tree, isn't it?
In some respects,
Yeah.
it's awful.
Yeah, it's definitely got some downsides to it. And this is another thing. There have been a number of people, since we've got time, I'll just mention a lot of people that I have talked with and worked with have expressed these similar types of frustrations. And I think when Family Tree started, you remember, how many of you guys used the old system, new.familysearch.org? Like,
I,
did anybody?
yes.
Yeah, so you remember in the old system, you could not change things. You could just add what they called opinions, and then you would end up with like a bunch of garbage on a record with all these like 40 different opinions on the name and the birthplace and just such a mess. So in the new one, as you know, again, they went to the opposite extreme, saying, well, if we give free rein to everybody, the good information is going to rise to the top, and eventually we'll have an accurate tree. The trouble is, in my opinion, that has turned out to be a false assumption because that's not what I'm seeing in the tree. I'm seeing, sister, exactly what you described, where people are um, going back and forth between different names and different people have different opinions and so forth. The bad merges are happening all over the place. The reason that I bring this up is I think Family Search started with the best of intentions, but I really feel like something has to change. The good thing is Family Search is very open to our feedback. And if you're not familiar with the Family Search community, let me bring it up on the screen here. just in case for those who may not have gone there, let's see, familysearch.org, and we want community. No, I'm wrong. It's community. There we go. So if you go to community.familysearch.org, this is a place where you can make suggestions. And if enough people keep making suggestions saying we've got to have better quality control, I really believe Family Search will listen. So I guess and that's not a short-term solution, that's a long-term solution. But I've been really gratified to see how suggestions that have been made here, Family Search has implemented them. Are there any other questions? Okay, then you guys, I think we're done, but I'll stick around if any other questions come up. And thank you so much for coming.
I do have a related comment.
Oh
Um,
yeah, go for it.
that last question. My grandmother was an identical twin. So of course they were born on the same day and
Yes.
had the same parents. And one of them was named Marguerite Alice, and the other one was named Alice Marguerite.
Oh my goodness. I can see the
So-
confusion coming.
Yes. So of course people kept merging them and I
Yeah.
kept unmerging them because I knew both of them. But as the family tree progressed over the years, we were able to add photographs and they could see there were two people and we added more
Hmm.
sources and that helped. But still, they would get merged now and then. And so I was able to call Family Search and ask them to put a lock on it and explain why. And they did do that for us.
Oh, wonderful. I did not know they would do that on requests of that. So that's good to know. Like I did know that they lock famous people, like Joseph Smith, the prophet of the first prophet is locked, Elvis Presley is locked, that type of stuff. Because I did you guys know Joseph Smith got baptized for the dead?
Oh,
No.
It's like so people like I can just imagine him getting and I apologize. I believe this expo is open to everybody, not just members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So this is specifically related to the church, but you can just imagine. So Joseph Smith founds a church and forgets to get baptized in it. And he gets over to the other side. Dang, I forgot to get baptized. It just makes me laugh that anybody would think, obviously they hadn't read the Doctrine and Covenants because it gives a clear account of him being baptized. And so he was being baptized multiple times for the dead. Anyway, yeah, so I knew they could lock those records, but I didn't know they would lock it in the case of like the problems such as you described, where the bad merge just kept happening and over and over. So that's really good to know. Thank you for sharing that.
You're very welcome.
interesting.
Hey, as long as we're here, for those who might be staying for the next class, if you have other questions, just completely unrelated to what we talked about in the earlier class, or comments or anything, please do feel free to share them.
Okay.
And I guess I'll put the next slide deck up, but obviously we won't start till the top of the hour.